Hey guys, welcome to yet another of my pool plan video. This time around I'm a little bit late. On the release of this video, we already actually had Jessie's event live. But anyway, I will still be covering my plans across these two events where Jessie and Cissnei are the primary featured units. First off, quick look on how I did in Leonora and Ida's events. I skipped Leonora event, didn't really have a lot of interest in her. I did initially plan the pool for Leonora, but then I found out that her force case charging is a little bit handicapped because she has a full up attack, in a way similar to how Ram's cure works. So given that she isn't as efficient a force gauge charger, and I don't really have a lot of need for her heals and her reviving aspect of her utility, I decided to just give Leonora a pass. I did pull for Ida. I had a lot of interest in how Ida's LD can potentially be abused, so I decided to chase her FRBT. Plus on top of this, I already do have 50 BT tokens saved up at this point, so I initially used 5000 gems just to round off the G tokens to 100 G tokens. Then I went in with tickets. I got Ida's FR, I think around 160 tickets or so. Then at that point in time, I thought might as well just stop it right there and traded my 50 BT tokens for her BT. That way I save on gems and tickets. I already have Luna Freya fully built, so Luna Freya's banner is an easy skip for me. If you are fairly new though and the banner is still live at the time of this event, I would highly recommend to at least pick up Luna Freya's LD just so you can access her LD call ability, which is one of the best calls in the entire game. So overall I spent 5000 gems, 160 tickets and 50 PT tokens. Moving on to Jessie's Lost Chapters. On this event, both Jessie and Snow receives a rework. Jessie will get a new BT weapon, whereas Snow will get a new FR. Starting off with Jessie, Jessie's S1, S2, EX and LD and her FR all receives a damage rework, and her damage is, I guess, pretty on par with most supports in the current meta. Notably also, her S1 delays an additional turn further, and her EX Plus, once used, also immediately fills her ally's EX meter to full. Note that it only fills her ally, it does not fill her own EX meter for obvious reasons. Jessie's new BT gives her an 8-turn BT aura. It has the usual party BT auras in the form of party brave damage plus 50%, brave damage cap plus 50%, HP damage plus 20%, and HP damage cap plus 30%. The unique thing about Jessie's BT is that it gives her a new overhead, and I'll just call it the bomb because it's sort of like a bomb. Once her BT aura is active, she gets this overhead, and her HP attack command is also changed to the bomb attack ability. Anytime anyone in the party does brave damage to the enemy, this damage is also stored in her overhead, in a way similar to how Estor's overhead stores value. This value in her overhead caps out at Jessie's max brave cap. When Jessie uses her modified HP attack, this unloads the stored value 3 times across the enemies. The interesting thing though is that while the stored value in her overhead is kept at Jessie's max brave, the damage that the ability can do is not kept at whatever HP damage cap she has. So for example, if you stack HP damage up effects to the high heavens, then the HP damage from her ability can surpass crazy amounts of damage. In that way, it's also very similar to Leonora's flare full up attack and Estor's abilities. The biggest drawback though with this is that anytime you use Jessie's modified HP bomb ability, it immediately uses up all the stored value, which means that you need to restore value in her overhead once more in order to use her HP bomb attack. So you can't really do this consecutively. You need to at least have one brave attack in between her bombs, which is a shame. If she can spam this attack in her BT mode, it's going to lead to a lot of damage. She can still use this attack a couple of times in her BT mode, and with enough HP damage up support, I can expect that this should deal some very nice damage overall. But really, I think it's just too much work required for the payoff. To me, while the potential damage is interesting, Jessie's highlights as always is her utility as an enemy turn delayer and a party turn manipulator. I don't really have a lot of need for this. Outside of this gimmick, unfortunately I don't think Jessie offers all too much, so my plan is to skip her. Moving on to Snow. Snow receives a rework, and he does have his PT released before, so it's a re-release, but he does get a new FR of this event. Snow's rework is pretty massive because he is a pretty dated character. His S1, S2, EX, LD, and his Retribution. Retribution is the attack he does at the start of his turn, all receives a damage rework. Notably, if he does his Retribution plus attack, that variant has 9 HP dumps in total. Snow's BT also receives a minor rework. Now it also provides an additional aura in the form of party HP damage cap plus 30%. Finally, moving on to Snow's FR. The FR conditionals are pretty okay for Snow. Whenever a party does an ice attack during your turn, you get plus 40%. Snow's BT does provide the party with ice enchant, so the first conditional should be pretty straightforward. Second conditional is just ending your turn with an overhead with stacks active, and that gives you plus 20%. This is a little bit more restrictive because not only do you require an overhead, you do also require an overhead that has stacks. The third conditional is dependent on the enemy's turn, so anytime anyone in your party takes brief damage, you get plus 20%. Overall, it is pretty okay. It's a bit of a mixed bag, so to get the most out of it, you need to have some sort of strat where the enemies are also taking turns. But I suppose, if you are using Snow, you'll probably be already preparing for that. Otherwise, there's not much point in using a tank in your party. Inside Snow's force time, he also does provide the party with additional HP damage resistance plus 30%. I'm not really a fan of Snow. He's okay in terms of party damage mitigation, but he doesn't provide a lot of often damage. His Retribution only triggers at the start of his turn, and the rest of his attacks aren't really that great in the DPS department as well. Before moving on, just a quick note that if you need a refresher on Jessie's FR conditionals, I did put it at the bottom right hand side of the slide as well. But her conditionals actually has not changed, it's still the same as it always was. Next up, we have World of Illusion Spiritus Diabolos, featuring the return of Cissnei with a newly released FR and BT weapon for her. Cissnei is also pretty dated at this point of the game. I can't even remember the last time she was featured. So her rework is also pretty big in terms of damage. Her S1, S2, EX and LD all receives a damage rework. Notably also, her S2 now gives an additional stack of her Wall Rekka. This is the ability that ties into the damage that her Link attack does. Her LD also grants one free skill use on her next turn. The key though for Cissnei is her newly released BT weapon, and really Cissnei is one of those characters where if you don't plan on getting her BT, you might as well skip her, because the difference between having a BT and no BT is night and day. In fact, more or less with BT, her damage output is essentially doubled. So if you are not wanting to get her BT, I would recommend to just skip her, because then there will be many other characters who likely perform better than Cissnei as a Link attacker. What does her BT do? Well, it provides her with a 6-turn BT aura that first of all provides the party with the usual party support auras in the form of Brave damage plus 50%, Brave damage cap plus 50%, HP damage plus 50%, which is actually a little bit more than average, and HP damage cap plus 20%. The key though is that while Cissnei's BT aura is up, Cissnei's Wild Rekka stack will not go down, so she always performs the plus variant of her link attack. On top of this, her link attack will also trigger twice per character action. Overall, I really like these changes for Cissnei because for one thing, it is fairly simple and straightforward to understand, and for another thing, it is pretty efficient. Cissnei's role was and always have been as a link attacker. Although her BT aura lasts only 6 turns, it doesn't really matter that much anyway, because most of the time, usually when you bring Cissnei in, you actually just want to set her up and then use other characters to hog all the turns. The fewer turns that Cissnei gets, the better it is. So in a typical battle, you really only give her turns to activate her BT aura and maybe use her force echoes. That's really about it. Meanwhile, as other characters are cleaning shop, she will be contributing a lot of additional damage. With her BT aura up, I think to date she's probably the strongest link attacker there is. The drawback, I guess, I don't know if you could even consider that. The drawback is that Cissnei is really all about damage. Beyond the damage from her link attacks, I don't really think she brings much else to the table. As maybe a point of comparison, you have, for example, Wise, who's recently featured. Wise is also a link attacker, but although Wise often damage is considerably lower than Cissnei's, Wise does also provide the party with debuff immunity. So there are some trade-offs here and there, but overall most of the time, if what you want is damage, then Cissnei is really the best choice there is. Cissnei also gets a new force weapon, and upon use, her FR increases her Wild Rekka stacks by 2, and her FR effects are firstly whenever anyone does a ranged attack, and this is a ranged attack anytime including off turns, get plus 5%. If Cissnei is the one that does the ranged attack, she gets 10% instead of the 5%. And lastly, whenever you do a critical brave damage during your turn, you get plus 40%. Now overall this looks pretty low, but it is a little bit deceptive because if you have Cissnei's BT aura up, don't forget she triggers her link attack twice. So anytime anyone takes a turn and triggers the link attack, you get plus 20% right there. Overall though, as the main FR, it isn't the most generic, because obviously not everyone is ranged, so the first conditional is going to be a bit tough to meet for the rest of the party besides Cissnei. But if you're in a pinch and you really need her to be the main FR, it should still be decent enough overall to build your force gauge bonus. So my plans here is to really go in for Cissnei. I'll start off with some tickets because I still have some to spare, but if I have to, I will use my gems to get her BT. The second banner with Lenna is easy for me. I already have Lenna fully built, so I won't be pulling on the second banner. But in the next slide, I'll also cover my evaluations on all these characters, including Lenna. So we've come to the part of the video where I'll cover my thoughts on all the secondary and primary featured characters that's been released. A lot of these obviously is biased towards my preference and playstyle, so take it with a pinch of salt. This time around there are 4 characters, which is Cissnei, Jessie, Lenna and Snow. And as you can see from the way I position the characters, I think all 4 really fits into the role fulfillment category. Generally, characters in this category I think are still obviously usable in endgame content. Really every character that's updated and released is usable in endgame content. But these are also characters that, depending on who you have in your roster already, you can probably skip these characters, and for the most part it should still be good. For the other category, which is the good value category, usually characters that I place here offer so much return in your investment that it's always a good idea to pick them up regardless of who you already have in your roster, because it's very likely that you'll be making a lot of use out of them. I don't think this time around anyone really fits into that category. To a certain degree, all 4 characters are more or less replaceable, but between the 4 characters I think Cissnei stands a little bit above the other three, which is why I placed them as such. So I'll start off with Cissnei first. Cissnei is overall a pretty simple character to use. Her primary role obviously is as a linked attacker, and the fact that her BT very simply double her link attacks. Although it's very straightforward, but I think it's also a very strong change for her. So much so that if you really want to use Cissnei, you must get her BT. Without the BT, her damage is half, maybe even less than half of what it is due to the loss of the BT auras. And really, the damage output out of all her other abilities doesn't really matter too much. Usually what you want out of her is her link attacks, while your other characters enter into BT mode or such. So if you sort of slot her and use her in a way that you make most use out of her link attacks, then she will truly shine, because she is really the hardest hitting link attacker in the game right now. So why isn't she in the good value category if that's the case? Well, there are obviously other options for link attackers as well. The more recent one, and I think his banner is still up, is the banner featuring Wise. Now, although other link attackers have a little bit less damage than Cissnei, I think in some cases the difference is worth it. I mentioned earlier in the video the example of Wise, where although he does do less damage than Cissnei in his Bullets of Ruin, but he makes up for it for the fact that he provides the party with also debuff immunity. And if you think about it, in the current meta, the stages aren't too hard anyway, so by no means do you really need the best link attacker out there to get the job done. If you already have other link attackers that you've built, Wise again as an example, but other options such as Dorgan as well, or Laguna with his Desperado debuff providing often damage, more or less you still get the job done for the stage anyway. Essentially, Cissnei's value to you, I think, would really be how much you need a link attacker for your party and roster, or whether or not you really want to have one. If you really don't want to have one, then it's really better to drop Cissnei overall. Moving on to the other three, and I'll start off with Lenna first. Lenna didn't really get a rework, but she's also a fairly recent character, so up till now she still does fairly good damage, especially against multi-target fights. To me though, I'm not really a fan because Lenna was originally more of a support character. They sort of bumped her damage up in her BT by providing her the follow-up attack. And while yes, more damage is always a good thing, I would prefer to have more strength to her support utility, so to speak. Lenna sort of currently fits into a weird sort of position in the meta where she does provide decent utility, she does provide decent damage, but for some examples you don't really need her debuff immunity. There are characters who can out damage her, there are characters who can also heal probably better than her, and she can't charge the force gauge as well, and to me that is a big con. I usually bring at least one force gauge charger in my party, which means that if I want to bring in Lenna, I need to bring in another character to charge the force gauge, and that's already 2 characters out of the 3 that I can use for the party. Personally, I think it's probably better to go for other supports that's currently featured. If you are fairly new and you run a good support, I would recommend to at least consider Leonora or Luna Freya over Lenna. Personally, among the current banners that are live, I actually say Luna Freya is the best pick for support, but I have to admit a lot of it also is because I'm really partially biased towards Quick Prayer. Moving on to Jessie. Someone made a comment on one of my community posts to say that there are some people who regard Jessie as a must pull. I don't really agree to it. Jessie is a utility support character. Her party support auras are actually pretty strong, and obviously now that she has access to BT auras as well, as an aura bot she is already pretty good, and she also provides more to it from her utility in delaying enemy turns, as well as giving you turn manipulation for your own party to boot. To me, that is really Jessie's strengths, And whether or not to pull for Jessie, I think depends on whether you want to have this support plus utility character. Her BT does give her options for damage from the new BT overhead. If you want a damage dealer, you might as well go for another unit. I don't think it's worth trying to focus on Jessie as a main damage dealer and maybe trying to go into her BT mode or something. The overhead attack that she can use is interesting, I'll give her that. And if you really stack a lot of HP damage up effects, you'll see some pretty big numbers. But unlike Leonora or Estos, you can't use her overhead attack every single turn because it drains her overhead value every time you use it. So you need to spend at least one turn to recharge her overhead. And I really just don't think it's worth the return, you have to go out of your way to try to stack HP damage up effects. So coming back to the utility that she brings, currently most stages you don't need that degree of party turn manipulation or turn delay for the enemy. Most fights nowadays are simple enough where you really only need to delay the enemies maybe once or manipulate your turns maybe once or twice, and that's it. The enemies are dead after that. And if that's the case, in my mind, you can always just use call abilities to do those. So for example, you have the Seed Rains or the Onion Knight, or maybe even the Jessie call for turn manipulation, and there are quite a lot of other calls that can delay. But if you're still learning the game and you want a character who can consistently do those things over and over again, then I think Jessie is a decent pickup. But once you have a fairly varied roster, then you realize that in most stages, just delaying the enemies once or twice is enough. And if you're using a range call, and most of the time most people are anyway, the turn manipulation that it provides is usually also enough. In short, I think whether or not to pull for Jessie really just depends on how much you need her turn delay and party turn manipulation utility. Finally, coming to Snow, I actually use Snow as my go-to to clear story chapters or lost chapters and such. Snow is one of those few that can actually mitigate both Brave and HP damage, but his Brave damage mitigation lies a little bit on the stacks on his buff, but usually in most cases it isn't that hard to get him to full mitigation, so I don't really think of that as a drawback. The one thing he has going against him, and that's actually the reason why I don't really want to pull for him, is the fact that he really lacks a reliable off-turn damage. His retribution is only triggered at the start of his turn, so compared to the other tanks, whether it be it mitigation or evasion tanks, we have characters such as Ruby Kante or Xcaliblur as an example. And yes, I know it's not really right to say Xcaliblur is a tank, but just coming from the aspect of taking hits, whether you want to mitigate or evade, and being able to counter, means that in a lot of those stages you can use characters who have the off-turn damage to solo. With Snow, it's going to be much more difficult, unfortunately. If you reduce his speed, the enemies will take a lot of turns, but he isn't really hitting them back during all the enemy turns. And really, I think even if I did pull for him, I don't think I'll use him much. I suppose, if you really have him green from way back, then you really only need his FR to complete, in which case he's somewhat of a budget pickup. But if you've never pulled for him before or green him, I really don't think he's worth the investment. In the current meta, really, there's many stages that you don't really need a tank, and in many videos that I see, usually tanks are only used nowadays when you want to solo stages, which is a shame. I guess if content is much more challenging and there's a lot of HP attacks coming your way and you need to really put a tank in your party, then characters such as Snow would rise in value. But as such, I would rather put a damage dealer and finish the stage earlier, or put a support character or a force case charger or something like that. Snow does none of it, he mitigates damage. And really, I think that's it for him. I can't think of any other thing that he does very well beyond mitigating damage. So that's it for this video. In summary, I plan to skip Jessie and Snow. I will very likely pull for Cissnei's FRBT, and Lenna, for me, I already have her build, so it's a no-brainer. I hope the video has been helpful, and if you enjoyed the content, do leave a like, comment and subscribe. Till then, I'll catch you guys in the next pool plan video. Bye!